My name is Ryan Commins and I'll be your host for our webinar this evening. First of all, a few household items. Just for your information, this webinar will be recorded and will later be published online. So if you do not wish to appear on the recording, you may turn off your video now and also remove your name from your screen by renaming yourself. Please remember to remain muted at all times for the sake of the recording. Second, to ask a question. During each webinar, you can submit questions to the speaker by typing them into the chat function. If you would prefer for your question to remain anonymous, you may send them in a private chat to the host, which in this case is me, Ryan Commins. Then, at the end of the presentation, I will share your questions with the moderator and the speaker, and you can submit your questions at any time of the presentation. Finally, there may be a point during today's presentation when you are asked to raise your hand. For those who are familiar with Zoom, there's an option to virtually raise your hand if you click on the icon that's labeled Participants. Otherwise, if you're not sure how to do this, you can simply physically raise your hand at home. A warm welcome to anybody who's joining this series of online webinars for the first time, and welcome back to everyone who joined 2 weeks ago for our foundational webinar on human evolution and violence. The European Peace Colloquy webinar series is organised by Peace Projects. Peace Project is a ministry of Community of Christ Europe and is headed by our Community of Christ European Peace and Justice team. Our aim is to provide members and friends of Community of Christ with easily accessible resources, materials, and understandings of peace work in the European context, and to give insight into how we might engage in mission together with others. As an online event, we have people joining from all around Europe, the USA, Canada, Australia, and the British Isles. A very warm welcome to all of you. The theme of our webinar series is Peaceful Humanity, a New Creation. We're excited about today's webinar and our distinguished speaker, and we look forward to sharing in this learning time together. For this series, we've created a model of 7 dimensions of peace that we'll be sharing at the beginning of each webinar. Our first webinar, 2 weeks ago, was a foundational introduction to the series. And all of our remaining webinars, starting today, will illustrate one of these 7 dimensions. And you can see on the screen here some of what those 7 dimensions are. Today's webinar on dehumanization and how to act as a neighbour explores the dimension of peace in the neighbourhood, which I recently discovered is also the name of a song by Paul. Learning how to act as a good neighbour can help us to recognise dehumanization in our local communities and also to proclaim a different story of peace, justice, and dignity for all. I also, just before I hand over, just want to briefly draw your attention to our next webinar, which will be on Thursday, the 6th of August, with Dr. Zach Harmon McLaughlin, Dean of Community of Christ Seminary at Graceland University. He will be talking about ecumenical and interfaith partnerships and advocacy. I'll now just pass over to Joey Williams to introduce this evening's speaker.
Thank you, Ryan. It is so good to see so many of you here for this webinar series, so welcome, and it's wonderful to have you all with us. I can't even begin to tell you how excited I am to introduce today's speaker, Andrew Bolton. Andrew is Northern English, but he has spent more than 25 years living outside of his own homeland, in Wales, Germany, Japan, and even the USA. He is a former religious education teacher at a state comprehensive school in Leicester, England, and a teacher trainer at Westminster College, Oxford. He worked for Community of Christ for 18 years and spent half of his career there coordinating peace and justice ministries for the church, and then 9 years coordinating the work of Community of Christ with 215 congregations in 10 countries. He met Community of Christ in Germany and was later baptized in South Wales. Andrew is married to Jewel Holmes, and together they have 2 amazingly talented sons, Matthew and David. And Andrew and Jewel are anxiously awaiting the arrival of their first grandchild later this year. Andrew is deeply passionate about justice and peace and is not only really smart, but very relatable for those of us just at the beginning of our peace journey. His dad was a British soldier for 7 years in World War II, and this had an important impact on his own pursuit of peace. I've been very fortunate to have known Andrew as a conscientious leader, a loving father of 2 sons, an attentive spouse, a dynamic teacher and preacher, a generous and caring landlord, and a treasured friend. And 6 years ago, I very intentionally asked Andrew to mentor me in the ways of peace, and he took that role very seriously. And my life has never been the same. I think if we can only grasp a portion of what he will share with us this evening, we will be sufficiently equipped to take the next steps to shaping this world into a more peaceful humanity. Andrew and his guests will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will open up for questions. So don't forget to send any of your questions during this presentation to Ryan in the chat function. Andrew, welcome and thank you for being a part of our 2020 European Peace Colloquy webinar series. We also welcome your 2 guests, Miles Hillman and David Forbes, who I understand you will be introducing yourself. Your audience is a diverse and international group with an interest in peace and justice, and there are potentially more than 150 people listening to us. We now look forward to your presentation on Dehumanization Yesterday and Today, How to Act as Neighbor. Miles and David, thank you also for joining us as guests. Andrew, tell us some stories.
Thank you very much, Joey. So the title of our talk is Dehumanization Yesterday and Today. Originally, it was advertised as When to Act as a Neighbor, and then I realized we should always act as a neighbor. So I changed it to How to Act as a Neighbor. The dimension that we're exploring of our peace model, the 7 dimensions of peace model, is peace in the neighborhood. So at the end of this, you will be equipped with some simple things that you can do to bring peace in the neighborhood. I want to begin with asking a short poll. If you've ever been dehumanized, had your dignity attacked, been put down, made to feel worthless, please put up your hand now. So I see lots of hands going up. Now, for the next question, you don't have to put your hand up. Have you ever dehumanized someone else? So I have, and I suspect all of us have, but I don't want you to have to own up to that. I want to take you now on a human rights pilgrimage based on the book East-West Street, on the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity, by Philip Sands. Philip Sands is an international lawyer who works at the University College London, and he wrote a magnificent book here. It reads like a novel, but it's a true and profound story. And how I came to go on this human rights pilgrimage was through my friend Miles Hillman. And I'm going to let that beginning story for us. Miles, over to you.
Well, good evening, everybody. What is my connection, first of all, with Andrew? How did we get involved? Well, I've known Andrew for over 50 years, since we were both young, naive northerners in the deep south of England at college. It was his misfortune to come from the wrong side of the Lancashire border, but I never held that against him. But I did used to take great pleasure in lighting his fuse wire for his iconoclastic views of the world, and then standing back and waiting for the explosion. But he always had a twinkle in his eye, and he always had a quick wit. As Andrew's mentioned, the background to the story Andrew will tell tonight is based on the book by Philip Sands that my sister Merle gave me, and it was so powerful that I decided to organise a visit to Lviv, where the book was set, and learn more. And I invited Andrew and Merle to join me. In fact, Professor Sands might be online tonight, and if he is, Philip, thank you very much for the inspiration. So why was I fascinated? Well, I am the son of a refugee. My father was German. He was driven out of Germany by anti-Semitism and by Nazism. He was not Jewish. In the 1920s, he was apprenticed as a carpenter in the Kiel shipyards. Unable to afford further education, he nonetheless studied at the Volksschule in the evenings and eventually passed and gained a scholarship at the Christian Albrechtshaus at Kiel University. In 1933, his Jewish professor, Professor Cohn, was expelled from Kiel University. This expulsion led to a furious argument between my father and the leader of the Nazi students, a certain Klaus Huckner, at the end of which Klaus Huckner said to my dad, "Herr Hillman, you need re-educating." The next day, he was arrested, sent to a camp on the island of Salt, where hard labour during the day was combined with learning Mein Kampf in the evenings. After a few months in the camp, he was deemed to have learned Mein Kampf well enough that he was allowed out of the camp for a weekend. But rather than go home, he headed north to Esbjerg, where he managed to stow away on a fishing boat bound for Arbroath in Scotland. He was welcomed to Scotland. My brother and my sisters and I are really appreciative of the welcome the UK gave him as a refugee. We are proud of his personal fight against totalitarianism and racism, and we do not forget it. Hopefully, my siblings and I have made a contribution as midwife, engineer, businessman, and social worker, and none of us have yet been convicted of any heinous crimes, which demonstrates, in a small way, the value to British society of welcoming refugees. Thank you.
So I'm going to take you to the Ukraine, and see where the blue arrow is, to the city of Lviv. Lviv was also known as Lemberg. It was a thriving city of trade, culture, and diversity, founded in 1256. And it was religiously pluralistic from the beginning. The prince was Orthodox Christian, his wife was Catholic, Armenians hung around too, and there was a Jewish population. The Jewish hospital you see pictured here was the best hospital in Lviv, and a third of its patients were Christian. Now, Philip Sands' grandfather was born in this house in Lviv, so Philip Sands has a connection in this story in terms of his family. It's a city of culture. Here's the opera house. And let me tell you now a little bit about the community, the Jewish community in Lviv. 110,000, a third of the city is nearly, well, over a third of a million population. 43 synagogues, 100 places of Jewish worship in total, Jewish artists, writers, theaters. It was a city of Jewish culture as well. But only 800 survived the Holocaust, a lower percentage than the Warsaw Ghetto, and there are only now 2 surviving synagogues. Lviv entered the territory of terror. Dr. Hans Frank, a lawyer, was the Governor General of Nazi Poland. He came to the University of Lviv in August 1942 to proclaim the extermination of the Jews in the city, who were gathered into ghettos and then taken on this train, thousands of them, to Belzec death camp in August 1942. This is by the Golden Rose Synagogue, which is a lovely story. And these are memorial stones in English, Hebrew, and other European languages.
In the ghetto, the hunger affected us. That terrible hunger in Lviv. Hunger is when you feel like an angry beast is tearing apart your insides. You start to see things. We would sit around the table, remembering how before the war, our plates would be full of different foods. I had only one wish, to eat a full plate of barley after the war. Lily.
The Janowska slave labor death camp, part of the industry of terror, was only 3 kilometers from Lviv, easy walking distance. This is the ravine by the death camp, where mass executions by shooting happened. Eerie place. Our guide, Peter, a German, very keen to tell this story faithfully and truly. As the Nazis began to realize they were losing the war, they needed to destroy the evidence, and this was a bone-crushing machine. The Soviets arrived to liberate the camp in 1944, and here they are in this grainy photograph investigating the mass graves. Today, it's a prison. I would hate to be here. I want now to talk about 10 stages of genocide from this story. First of all, classification, us and them. We're going on a journey now to understand how genocide happens. Symbolization, the Yellow Star of David, a registry. Discrimination, your rights reduced, taken away. Dehumanization, called vermin, terrorists. Genocide is always planned. Polarization, extremists silence the moderates. Preparation, propaganda, armed militias. Persecution, death lists, ghettos with insufficient food, and then extermination, mass murder. And the final stage is denial, the bone-crushing machine. So what's the relevance of all of this past story for today? Classification, symbolization, discrimination. I realized that if you're black or brown in European society, you're already past steps 1 and 2, and often suffering from discrimination, step 3. Dehumanization, hate speech. This is a quote from the Sun newspaper website in Britain by Victor Young about migrants. Send them back where they come from, bunch of cockroaches trying to invade. Many other examples can be used for this. So I want to now just briefly point out the rise of the far right and popularism today. There's no agreed definition of popularism, but it's people versus the elite, a charismatic leader who's promising much, can be left or right. Far right popularism is about white people versus minorities, be they Jews, blacks, Muslims, immigrants, or refugees. About the rights of the majority, but no rights for minorities. Here are some examples. Mr. Trump, Marie Le Pen, France's National Front, Tommy Robinson, Britain, Nigel Farage, Brexit movement, Alternative für Deutschland, anti-immigrant, Muslims, Jews, LGBT, and racist, climate change skeptics, traditional roles for women, reintroduce conscription, pro-USA, and ironically pro-Israel. Heinz Christian Strache, Alliance for the Future of Austria, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and 2 weeks ago, President Duda became president again of Poland. I want now to introduce my friend David Forbes, a Quaker from Birmingham, England, to talk about the hostile environment for immigrants and refugees in the UK. David, over to you.
Yes, it's a wonderful leveler, this particular system. In this pandemic, in this time of Black Lives Matter and of Greta Thunberg, it's hard to imagine anyone using a hostile environment as a selling point. But that's what Theresa May, the then UK Home Secretary, did in 2012. Unfortunately, we are still living with the dehumanizing consequences of this today. It's most striking manifestation for me is a new style poll tax on migrants and refugees in the UK, which is disguised as government fees. Take the example of Moat and Babel, a refugee couple from Ethiopia. As their registered legal rep, I'm free of charge, I recently handed them their permanent resident ID cards. And as recognized Geneva Convention refugees, they have escaped the poll tax so far. But now they will face it in that they will have to pay £1,300 sterling each if they want British citizenship. And if their newly born son, Jude, had been born now, he would have been born British. But as he was born last week before they got their status, it seems they will have to naturalise him at a cost of a further £1,000 and a lot of bureaucracy. So they have a bill of £3,600. Another client, Hajara from Nigeria, arrived pregnant from the Lebanon, as it happened, the war in Lebanon in 2007, so that her son, Michael, was born in the UK and was in fact eligible for registration as a British citizen at the age of 10 in 2017. But Hajara has never been able to afford this until now. It costs £1,000. She is not a convention refugee, but one of a larger population granted so-called discretionary leave on a long 10-year route to permanent resident status, divided into 2.5-year slices. And it's marked by 4 poll tax or fee payments of £2,000 per person per time, regardless of age or condition. So that's £4,000 for her and Michael, totaling for them over the 10 years £16,000. She got this status under the rules when Michael reached 7 years of age in 2014. There are no terms and conditions, but she can escape either by making out a complicated case for a fee waiver, for which she would have to pay a solicitor if it weren't somebody like me. She succeeded in that in 2016, but failed last year. Or she can make further submissions as a person who was previously refused refugee status, which is free. We've had to do the latter, but making these free submissions is treated as an interruption of her 10-year route march to permanent settlement. So now, while the Home Office are mulling over her case in a process which may take 6 to 12 months or more, she has the right to stay, but she has lost her job because the employers are told that she's no longer entitled to work. She's lost her job as a low-paid care worker, despite the huge need for such people in this pandemic. The only concession has been to grant her just enough welfare benefit to survive under the universal credit scheme in this country. In the hostile environment with its neo-poll tax, the path to citizenship is long and hard and disempowering. Dehumanization can only be arrested to some extent by the intervention of charity lawyers like myself and allied welfare workers. There are all too few of us, and agonizingly, we often fail to buck the system. It's a system based on a targeted, hostile environment. And what's more, it was adopted by professing Christians, Theresa May and David Cameron. To rephrase Lord Acton's famous dictum about the corruption of power, we can say that all management targets tend to dehumanize. Absolute targets dehumanize absolutely. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, David, for telling us those stories. So, immigrants and refugees in this country are already on step 3 of the genocide process. So how do we resist dehumanization, hate speech, and the possibility of genocide today? What can we do? I was during the day in our week in Lviv with Miles and Murrell, understanding the process of dehumanization in World War II for Jews. I was at the same time in the evening reading this book, Anti-Migrant Hate Speech, published by the Quaker Council for European Affairs and written by Andrew Lane. Now, I'd met him just the weekend before, and so I'm reading what's happening today as I'm reading about what happened yesterday. And he said this that struck me. He said, we tell an alternative story to go against the anti-migrant hate speech. We don't counter hate with hate. We're truthful, we do careful research, and we appeal to long-held values in the culture, in European culture. So I'm going to tell you, I'm going to equip you, I'm going to remind you of stories that you all know that we can use to create what he calls an alternative narrative, an alternative story. All humans are made in the image of God. We're crowned with glory and honor. That means we're all royalty. God is on the side of slaves, the poor. 35 times it said God's on the side of strangers and we should do good to them. 35 times, more than any other commandment. And as Isaiah said, we protect the widow and the fatherless, the most vulnerable in society. Ironically, these are Jewish stories. I find that really funny. Ironically. For God so loved the world, if we go to the New Testament, not the white people, not the black people only, but the whole world. Love your neighbor as yourself is an Old Testament commandment, said only once in Leviticus 19:18, but repeated 7 times more in the New Testament. Love your neighbor as yourself is about profound equality, dignity for you, dignity for others that you come in contact with. In Matthew 25, Jesus is the stranger, the outsider. So when we abuse a stranger, when we abuse a migrant or refugee or somebody who's not our race, we're abusing Jesus, according to the Christian story. It's stories about the worth of all persons, that there are no exceptions. And for those of you who are Community of Christ or friends of Community of Christ, when Missouri Governor Boggs issued his extermination order against our people in 1838, that should give us empathy for the worth of all persons. Continuing the stories, one of values, if you're secular or humanist, I want to remind you about the discourse of human rights. We are all born with rights. They cannot be sold, bought, or taken away. We have them just simply because we're human. I love this phrase, but don't tell my British friend.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So, unalienable means that it can't be bought, can't be sold, can't be taken away. Story set number 2. I'm grateful for this beginning paragraph by George Monbiot in the Guardian newspaper here in Britain about 2 weeks ago. He said, facing inequality and exclusion, poor wages and insecure jobs, people should be angry with the billionaires. Instead, they're persuaded by billionaire-owned media and billionaire-funded political parties to unleash their fury on immigrants, Muslims, the European Union, and other alien forces. This distracts ordinary people from seeing the real problem. The real problem is an economy that serves the rich, not everyone. It's about dehumanization by poverty. And my brother is a mechanic, and he's bought into this until I told him an alternative story. Let me remind you about Bible economic stories. Genesis is about the creation of a bountiful earth to bless all humans. Exodus was about God freeing slaves. The prophets of Israel thundered about economic justice. Jesus quotes Isaiah right at the beginning of his public ministry in the synagogue in Nazareth by saying these words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor." The early Christians in Jerusalem lived all things in common. They were socialists. So when we look at the 7 dimensions of peace that Ryan referred to at the beginning, and we're doing tonight, peace in the neighborhood, we also have to look at peace in the marketplace. We have to look at economic peace. Stories number 3, stories of resistance. I love the story of Shiphrah and Puah. They're midwives of the Hebrews in Pharaoh's Egypt, and they're ordered by Pharaoh to murder, to kill the baby boys as they're born of Hebrew mothers. Now they refuse to do this very quietly. It's the first recorded act of civil disobedience over 3,000 years ago that I know about. And they're named Shiphrah and Puah, stood against genocide. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Karl Barth, helped with many others form the Confessing Church in the 1930s against Nazism. Denmark is an interesting story. Over 7,000 Jews were held in Denmark, occupied Denmark, but the Danish government and ordinary Danish people contrived to protect them. And 7,200 of Jews with 700 relatives escaped through Danish boats to Sweden. Unfortunately, 470 were taken to Theresienstadt, a concentration camp, where 120 died. All of them would have died, though, if the Danish government had not been so diligent in inquiring regularly about their welfare. In Italy, I don't know if Bettina's on, but in Italy there were 40,000 Jews. 80% survived. In Germany, it was only 23% survived the war. In Italy, ordinary Italians, Italian police, and Italian bureaucrats forged false identity papers, protected the Jews in Italy so that 80% of them survived. It's an amazing story. Genocide is not inevitable, even if you become an occupied country. And then the village of Le Chambon, a wonderful story in France, 300 kilometers from the Swiss border, saved a village of 5,000 people, saved 5,000 people during World War II, 3,000 of whom were Jews. There's a wonderful film made by a baby who was born in Le Chambon, and ironically didn't know the story until he was 18. And then there are stories of accountability. I think a major accountability this year when Edward Colston's statue, who was a slave trader, was dumped unceremoniously into Bristol Harbour. That's accountability. Jan Reid, a statue of Jan Reid, one of the protesters, was put where Edward Colston had stood. Martin Luther King said this: "The arc of the moral universe is long, takes a while, but accountability does come because the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice." And so we come back to East-West Street, the story being told by Philip Sands that took us to Lviv, Ukraine. You remember that his grandfather was born in Lviv. Also in this story, remember he's an international lawyer. Also in this story, he tells this story, a story of 2 international lawyers. Both did their student training in law in Lviv. Both, like Philip Sands, lost family in the Holocaust. One was Hirsch Lauterpacht, And for him, international law was rooted in individual rights. Lauterpacht got to the safety of Britain, became a famous Cambridge law professor. The other individual is Raphael Lemkin, and he, as a lawyer, argued for group rights. To kill a whole group of crime, a whole group of people, was genocide, a crime. In fact, he invented the word genocide. At the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals, 1945 to 1946, it was Lauterpacht's influence that was felt most at this trial, of human rights law being rooted in the rights of the individual. But after the Nuremberg trials, genocide became convention and part of international criminal law. Now I want to tell a very simple story of Civility in Hildesheim, a German town on the Rhine River, and Civility at the time of the Nazi Revolution. And I'm going to talk about greetings. Everybody greeted everybody. It created community in the town. It enabled a normalcy in extraordinary difficult times up to 1935. So greetings preserved civility, created community. This changed with the Nuremberg laws, Nazi laws, that came into force in 1935. This involved replacing all previous German flags with the swastika, the Nazi flag. No sex between Jews and Aryans. And citizenship was to be based on race, not on the fact that your family had been living in Germany for generations. Flags made it possible to identify initially who was Jewish in the neighborhood, because Jews were not permitted to fly the Nazi flag. Greetings changed. It became Heil Hitler, loaded with political obedience and significance, not Guten Tag anymore. Jews were not greeted, so began to be made vulnerable, isolated for the next step of the genocide process. But some continued to greet Guten Tag, to say hello, did not ostracize their Jewish neighbors. So, coming to some kind of conclusion about peace in the neighborhood, include, get to know your neighbors, where you live, build community. That simple act creates peace in the neighborhood. And it's been easier in our street in these pandemic times because people are reaching out to each other in mutual help. So simply saying hello, good day, Guten Tag, builds a buttress against genocide. You treat all people with equal worth. You remember, love your neighbor as yourself. You proclaim an alternative story of inclusion and equal human dignity. And for Europeans, we protect and use the European Convention on Human Rights, the Council of Europe and European Court, important developments that happened shortly after the end of World War II in Europe, but now threatened in Britain because of Brexit. We may opt out of these things. So then to ask this question, what should be the heart of Europe going forward? What should we support as the heart of Europe? Its history of more than 3,000 years, a common market, a Christian civilization. I suggest that we make Auschwitz, God's agony, the heart of what we stand for in Europe, so that we work so that Auschwitz never happens again. And no Auschwitz means also no Lviv, no Bosnia, no Rwanda, etc. So to finalize what I'm wanting to say, we can do this simply by greeting your neighbors, all of them, telling alternative stories of equal human worth, economic justice for all, resistance and accountability. go and do it.
Thank you so much, Andrew, Miles, and David, for sharing in this presentation. You've given us many things to reflect on and many ideas to consider. I'm pretty amazed at what I've just heard, and I know there may be several questions for either you, Andrew, or some of your guests, Miles or David. And so I want to remind everyone, if you have questions, to put those in the chat function right now, and I'll let Ryan begin to put together some of these questions, but I want to start with an initial question for you, Andrew. In this presentation, you mentioned genocide a few times, and genocide is a very dark subject. Luckily, I heard you say genocide is not inevitable. And then you also pointed out that there's a rise of the far right in Europe and elsewhere. And for me, this is pretty scary. So my question is there any hope? And if there is, what can ordinary people do?
So I think dumping Edward Colston's statue into the harbour water of Bristol tells me that people can mobilize with incredible energy to resist the forces of darkness, the forces of discrimination, the forces of racism. So I find a lot of hope in that. But in the meantime, we organize at the grassroots, so we're ready for those occasions. And I want to say, Crucifixion Friday happens, but Resurrection Sunday is coming.
Great, thank you. Let's check in with Ryan and see if there are any questions from the participants who have been listening to this presentation.
Thank you, Jerry. We have had a few questions. Thank you to everybody who's been submitting your questions, and please do continue submitting them in the chat. We had a question from Ron, who asked a question about relativism. And Andrew, you talk a lot about sharing an alternative story in your presentation. Ron asks, how do we address relativism where there's no universal agreement on universal truths that should guide human interaction? To link it to your presentation a little bit more, how do we go about sharing an alternative story when people seem to be saying, well, that might be your story, but it's not my story?
So that's part of the struggle. But people can be drawn in by the fact that our story, the stories I'm suggesting, include everybody. Everybody is of dignity. No one is second class. Those are the stories we tell. And then people have to make a decision about that. And then we live the story. We demonstrate the story. And so that people can see that we're serious about it.
Thank you very much. We had another question as well from Wendell, who asked, what role do you think the United Nations has in uplifting human rights? So
the preamble to the UN Charter in 1945 that was signed by 50 delegates from 50 different countries on the 26th of June, 1945, says that the purpose of the United Nations is for the defense of human rights for men and women, and for countries large and small. So that's the foundational stone of the United Nations. And we're celebrating that on Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation with a lecture I'm giving on the 8th of August. Then a couple of years later, I think it's 1948, on the 10th of December, Eleanor Roosevelt was chairing the committee that produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that's a very, very important document. It's the most translated document in the world. More important than the Bible in terms of translation.
Thanks. We had another question about economics. I think we've had a couple of questions on this, actually. People recognize that our current economic system is horribly unjust, but practically, how do we move towards a more just economic system that recognizes and upholds the worth and dignity of all people?
So that's a really important question. So first of all, I'm arguing on biblical grounds. I'm not arguing on the grounds of Marx or secular socialists. So my grounds are on biblical grounds. That's very important to hear, first of all. The second thing, if I may tell a British story, is the first Labour MP, first socialist member of parliament, Keir Hardie, was a Christian lay preacher. The fourth leader of the Labour Party was a member of the Anglican Church, and their socialism came out of their Bible reading. And a member of the Labour Party in the 1950s, his name escapes me for the moment, says, British socialism owes more to Methodism than it does to Marx. So I celebrate that. So it's a Christian socialism we're arguing for. And we vote for policies that take us in that direction. I'm really intrigued by the idea of a universal basic income. So universal basic income, look that up. That's a movement that may be really important to level the playing field in the future. And then the last thing to say is there's a book called The Spirit Level. It's written by two British epidemiologists. Epidemiologists study disease. They look at the correlation between human economic equality and well-being in the society. And the more equal the society, the better people are, everybody is in that society. And they do that with American states as well. So the more equal the state in the United States, the better everybody is. So economic for health and other measures as well.
Thank you. We had another question, which reminds me actually of the last peace colloquy that we had, which we held in person at Dunfield House, where we had two presenters who were there because of civil disobedience actions that they'd undertaken. And you talk about civil disobedience in your presentation. And Andrew asks, when is civil disobedience justified and when is it not?
Civil disobedience is always justified if it's breaking an unjust law. When you do it, how you do it creatively, strategically is the important question. You don't throw yourself away without being part of a creative strategy to change. Civil disobedience is breaking law, is different from criminal disobedience. Both criminal disobedience and civil disobedience are about breaking the law. Civil disobedient people don't run away. They take the punishment. And by their example, draw attention to an unjust law. So Gandhi brought down the British Empire in India. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was an act of civil disobedience that triggered the civil rights movement in the United States. But it was part of a plan. She didn't do that just accidentally.
Thank you. On that same question, I wonder whether either David or Miles would have anything that they would like to add to that question of where civil disobedience is justified and effective, and where it isn't. Feel free to unmute yourself, either David or Miles, if you would like to respond.
Oh, yeah. I find increasingly as getting old, and retiring and so on. But I find that giving services free of charge looks pretty much like civil disobedience. And here we're really tackling something which is often at the heart of our Western societies, and looking across the pond there to the United States in particular, lawyer culture, shall we say, where everything is there at a price, pretty much up front, shall we say. So I think doing things for nothing, which I think there's something profoundly Christian about doing that, and perhaps profoundly other religions as well about doing that, that is a challenge. And I've had difficulties with my regulator in the way I approach things which are not done along commercial lines, which they try to impose upon everybody. So we've got a kind of underlying management target, which assumes we got to charge for all the values we give, not like in this wonderful Zoom meeting we're at the moment.
Thank you very much. We had another question.
Miles may want to come in.
Well, I was just going to add that I from my own perspective, I'm not involved in civil disobedience on a national level. I think it comes back to Andrew's comments about being part of the community and working in the community, and it's the question of personal persuasion, question of convincing other people about the iniquities of the dehumanization, racism, and totalitarianism. And that's the way that I, as a simple citizen, regard it. And if that involves disobedience at a personal level, then that's it. Because of these circumstances, then that's justified. So that's my personal view.
Thank you so much, Miles and David. We had another question, which was kind of linking to Andrew, in your presentation, you talked about the steps towards genocide, those 10 steps towards genocide. The idea that we're framing this whole series of webinars around is a new peaceful humanity. So what would be the steps towards a new peaceful vision for humanity instead? So
originally, Guy Stanton had 8 steps, and I matched them up with the 8 Beatitudes. The 8 Beatitudes take some, Jim Forrest talks about the 8 Beatitudes as 8 steps on a ladder to being the city on a hill, light to the world, salt of the earth. So you begin at the lowest step, which is blessed are the poor in spirit. Then you mourn for the sins of the world and your own sins. And you go up, you hunger for justice, for righteousness. You are willing to practice mercy. You are pure in heart. You don't have mixed motives. So the Beatitudes take us on a journey of conversion that is the exact opposite of the genocide process.
Thank you very much.
Watch for the book that's coming out.
Thank you so much to Andrew and to David and to Miles. I think I speak for everybody in saying that we've really enjoyed your presentations and the things that you've been able to share with us today. I'll hand over to Joey now to say a few closing remarks, and then after that we will wrap up the formal part of the meeting.
Yeah, thank you so much. It seems I'm trying to draw a couple conclusions from what I've been hearing during this presentation and the questions that we've just had. And one of the words or phrases that sticks out to me, Andrew, is when you said, never again. So we hold up, especially for Europe, this idea of genocide, and we say never again. And then I just love that last answer of the idea of literally having these steps in the Beatitudes that are counter to the steps of dehumanization that might lead towards genocide. I really appreciate that reflection. I also heard that there's great hope in small acts of kindness, and not only hope, but great transformational power in our neighborhoods, just through our greetings, the way we treat our neighbors, saying hello in the morning when we pass people on the sidewalks, that everyone here that's listening can begin to make a great impact just by considering the smallest acts of kindness with our own neighbors. And then lastly, I think one of the major themes that I heard is this concept of alternative stories. So telling stories is a powerful method for changing our mentality and changing and shaping the narrative of the world. And so when we have stories that are not stories of destruction, but yet stories of hope, stories of economic justice, and when we, just like when David was sharing his story, I began to ask this question, oh my gosh, there's not enough people working on this for immigration. What can we do? What possible solutions are there? And so hearing an alternative story can be a very powerful thing for us. The tagline for this series and for peace projects is, what would you do for peace? And so before we end today, I would really like for all of our guests, for Miles, David, and for Andrew, for you to respond to the question, because I know you're already doing many things, but in light of what we've just heard, what would you do for peace? And let's start with Miles.
Well, what I would do for peace is, as you referred to the stories, but to actively ensure that where you are involved with conflict, i.e., racism, with people being put down, that you stand up for it, and you actually put yourself forward as putting the viewpoints or telling the stories or putting the arguments against that kind of dehumanization.
Thank you, Miles. What about you, David? David, what would you do for peace?
During the pandemic, I don't know whether other people have the same experience. I seem to be doing more prayer on these Zoom type things than I've been doing before. And I seem to have more time for it. So I think that being an activist and a contemplative, that is going back to those famous Beatitudes, is very important. And along the way, I nearly every night I play part of César Franck's Les Béatitudes, which is a very long work which nobody has any time for in normal times, but I've rediscovered it. So I think it's I think the answer is, and maybe other people say the same thing, it begins with me, you know.
Thank you, David. And Andrew, what would you do for peace?
So at the back of our house are community gardens. They call them allotments in Britain. And Leicester's a very diverse city, and the allotments are diverse. The cultivation methods are diverse. Different races, different cultures were all there. And I'm writing an article and taking photographs and telling the story of coexistence, neighborliness, sharing of vegetables on the allotments.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew and Miles and David, for joining us this evening and sharing your stories, as well as, Andrew, your presentation with us. We will do a follow-up podcast soon that will be available on Project Zion Podcast. So keep your eyes out for that. Back to you, Ryan.
Just a reminder to everybody about the next session in the series, which will be at the same time, so 7 p.m. UK time, on Thursday, the 6th of August. It is the same Zoom link and password as for this one. And as I mentioned before, we'll have Zach with us, who'll be tackling ecumenical and interfaith partnerships and advocacy. So a big thank you to Andrew, Miles, and David for a very moving and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you also to Joey and to all of you who've joined us on Zoom this evening or afternoon or morning, depending on your time zone. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time on Thursday, the 6th of August, for our next presentation in this series. Thank you so much for joining us, and we really hope that you enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.